Quick disclaimer. Opinions of host and guest do not represent the views or opinions of Functional Movement Systems. Always consult your physician before beginning any exercise program. This general information is not intended to replace your healthcare professional. Welcome to the Movement Podcast. This show is all about movement. We tackle it from different angles, bring on guests, answer questions, go on a few tangents, and give practical advice, giving you guys a better idea of how you can optimize the human body to be the best it can be. Let's preview what's coming up in this episode. With college scholarships and pro dreams on the line, kids feel more pressure than ever to specialize in one sport and participate year-round. But does the science support this trend? On today's episode, we bring on multiple experts to discuss youth sports, from elementary to high school. We get an in-depth look at what works, what doesn't, and answers on how to build young athletes. If you are a parent, coach, teacher, or rising star, this show is definitely worth your attention. So circle up, grab a knee, and let's get ready for this special edition of the Movement Podcast, powered by FMS. Our first guest today is Dr. Greg Rose. Greg is co-founder of the Titleist Performance Institute and works with athletes in many different disciplines from adolescence all the way through the pros. Greg sits down with the guys and discusses sports specialization from an early age and what the science says about how to build successful future sports stars.
People like to talk about the billboards of working with pro sports, but I think one thing that we're all passionate about and something that's needed to be discussed a lot more candidly now is youth sports and some of the problems that are going on in youth sports. But, let's not focus on the problems. Let's focus on how we can offer some solutions. So I think we got, two great guys here, Greg and Gray, to kind of talk about that. And Greg, you really do a lot in youth sports people don't know about.
Hey, yeah, Lee, let me just real quick just paint the picture of the problem with youth sports. So parents are listening, coaches are listening. We have a massive problem with sport participation in the United States. And we talk about movement all the time and how important that is for just longevity and just for your life. One of the best ways to keep your movement is to play some type of sport and stay active. But the data is really clear now that we actually lose 80% of all kids by the age of 14 of playing any sport, which is unbelievable. 70% by the age of 13. And one of the reasons is because of early specialization and the whole nature of getting a college scholarship. And I think that entire narrative needs to change if we want to do something good for our kids. And I always say, here's the difference between, most coaches are looking for talent. They're trying to pick talent identification instead of sport participation. And let me kind of just paint the picture there is talent identification, or let's say talent identification would be like this. Imagine if we went to first grade. You took your kids to first grade and they said, all right, if you get an A, you get to go to second grade. And then in second grade, if you get an A, you get to go to third grade. And in third grade, if you get an A, you get to go to fourth grade. By the time we got to 12th grade, there'd be 10 kids. All the other kids would be eliminated, right? That's youth sports right now. Is everybody's looking for the most talented. The problem is you can't actually predict talent before their growth spurt. So under 12, people are horrible at predicting talent because it takes people time to develop. And sport participation is what we do in school. Sport participation would be, you go to first grade, you don't need to get an A. You can be like Gray, you can get a D, and you can still get to second grade. All you need minimal proficiencies to be able to advance, right? So sport participation is about, what are the minimal proficiencies I need to enjoy the sport, have fun, and keep progressing? And somehow here in the United States and around the world, we've lost touch of that. It's all about, hey, if you get an A, you get to move on. If not, sports isn't for you. And it's a huge health problem.
Well, the whole reason everyone's playing one sport is it goes back to the talent thing. Everybody assumes you got to play one sport year-round, 24 hours a day in order to continue to progress.
The data does not support that. If you look at the best athletes in the world, if you look at all of our athletes, the ones that are the best are the ones that were multi-sport, right? We always say, listen, it's athlete first, sport second. So in other words, I asked my coaches, I'm like, all right, listen, you guys aren't golf coaches, but let's say I said at 12 years old, I'll give you two choices of somebody you're going to try and coach to become a professional golfer. I'll give you the best 12-year-old golfer in the country right now, right? And it's all they've ever done is play golf, and it's a little laser and perfect. Or I'll give you the best athlete, 12-year-old in the United States right now that's never played golf. Which one would you take?
Oh, most everybody's going to gravitate to the golfer.
And they would be wrong. right? Because basically when you meet a athletic golfer like a Brooks Koepka or a Dustin Johnson, you realize that, we trained a young PGA Tour player by the name of Peter Uihlein since he was 9 years old. His dad was the CEO of Titleist, so obviously we were introduced to Peter really young. Peter, when he got to 21 years old and was at the U.S. Amateur, on the first tee, he outdrove in the finals, he outdrove the person he was competing with by almost 100 yards. Can you imagine being like, you've played your whole life, you got to the U.S. Amateur, one of the top tournaments for amateur golf, you're in the finals, and you're up against this guy, and all you've done is played golf, but now you're up against an athlete, somebody who's trained like a ballistic athlete that then actually added golf skills, and they outdrive you by 100 yards. You just look at yourself and you go, I have no chance of winning. And that's what happens with a lot of these players is they just focus on one sport, they don't develop the athletic skills, they don't develop the power, and they're great at just hitting it straight, but as soon as they meet somebody who can hit it 100 yards past them and straight, they have no chance. So I'm always like, hey, listen, would you rather have your kid win the U12 championships or the Masters? Because it's different the way we would train them.
Now, you gave a lot of professionals, when you did the golf junior manuals and you started talking about juniors in golf, and from a guy who's been as specialized and focused as you have been in golf, giving people permission not to over-specialize, or maybe even one step further, actually commanding that they don't, and then presenting the tests that show that's too much golf and not enough hand-eye. Well, that's too much golf and not enough skipping, Yeah,
think about it. I did the same thing. I didn't specialize in golf when I started, right? You would get this base of knowledge and then decided, hey, I want to specialize in golf. That's what the kids should do. And I always tell parents, listen, the more we study this, the more we research this, I truly believe you only have one chance to do this right. And it's easy to create an athlete first. It's not easy. You can create an athlete first, and then you can create the sport-specific movement second. I don't know if you can do the other way around. In other words, if they get to a point where they're old, and most people don't want to hear me say this, but when you get past the age of like 17 or 18 and you're old, it's really hard to create the athlete, right? Like a lot of these, I call them fuel types. Like you almost develop what fuel type you use when you're young. And I always say you can have either rocket fuel, jet fuel, gasoline, or diesel. Which one would you rather have, right? If you're an athlete, you want rocket fuel. I don't feel like you can develop rocket fuel or jet fuel in anybody, any human after the age of 18. It's really, really difficult. Now, I can make you a fast car that uses gasoline, but if you ever meet a jet or a rocket, they're going to blow past you, right? And it's just something that you only have one chance to do this right. So if you have kids out there and they're just doing one sport and they're not developing these athletic skills, you can't go back in time.
Well, that's what you do, Greg. I mean, what you recommend is for kids training. Let's say you got a 12-year-old golfer. You're not training them for golf. You're training them just to be an athlete. You're having to do all types of activities.
So we mix golf into our athletic development program, right? So we always say it's athletes first and then the sport second. So the cool thing about this, like in our junior golf programs, I always say, listen, anybody can work with a professional athlete. If you're a horrible coach or strength coach, sometimes a great athlete makes you look good. Even if you say the wrong thing, they still do it good. So I don't want to make this sound bad, but I do believe anybody can work with a professional athlete. But let me see you make one. I mean, that's a whole different ball game, right? So it's a whole different skill. It's a whole different type of science. And there is a lot of science behind this, and that is really, really important. And we know that, it's like you're going to bake a cake, right? If you're going to bake a cake, there's certain recipes, there's certain things that you need in that cake to make this cake taste good, right? We know that athletic skills is one of them. So when you're young, there's so many of these different skills that we can develop. So what we do is the cool part is in our golf program, if you bring your son or daughter to our golf program, they're going to be, sometimes they'll show up after class and they've got like blood on their elbow, and their parents are like, what the hell happened? He's like, oh, I slid into the base and I cut myself. And they're like, base? Weren't you at golf school? We're like, so we're doing all these types of athletic stuff, and it's more like PE. And the cool part about that is I can't tell you how many kids have come to our golf program that we're creating these ballistic athletes, and we have them hit golf balls, and we have them hit tennis balls, and we have them throw baseballs, and we'll sit down with the parents after 2 or 3 years, and we're like, listen, I know you've got them here in our golf program, and they're doing awesome, but we're like, have you seen them hit a tennis ball? Like, they should be in tennis. Like, you can almost see some of these different things because we're hitting all the athletic skills. So even if you decide to change your sport, like let's say you've been in our program for 8 years, you haven't missed anything. We developed the athlete that'll apply to any sport. If that
Now, it
makes
sounds like you're almost talking, if you have a young child and you're trying to socialize that child, get them exposed to other people and other places in the world, it's movement socialization. And that's all you're doing is letting a lot of different movement varieties wash across this person, because each one develops something that, and I think the way you've picked it, it's not just a bunch of random activities. Everything is transferable at a base in a plane of motion or something like that. So, but I honestly think in sports specificity, if you're doing anything other than rotation with a baseball or golf kid, people look at you like, I would always watch my young baseball players and golfers do a push-up and a squat, realizing, if they can't do those two things and yet they're prized as a youth golfer, there's a lot of untapped potential that we got to get to quick, because they're learning to play golf without their body, not with it.
Right. You know what the number one predictor of ball velocity, of exit velocity, let's call it, for either hitting a baseball or hitting a golf ball, is vertical jump height. Right. That's not rotation or striking. That vertical jump is one of I can almost predict your exit velocity with your golf ball within 2 miles an hour by looking at your vertical jump. Right. So that tells you there's no rotation in that. That's just pure linear, go straight up, but it's a measurement of the engine, the athletic engine, and how big it is, right? So important. And I'll tell you one other thing that's interesting is I've worked with a lot of number ones in the world, but there's two number ones in the world that I think were very different, and that's Pete Sampras and Yvonne Lendl from tennis, right? Both of them, I had some interesting conversation because we preach this multi-sport, and every great athlete I've ever worked with has done multiple sports. When I asked them, they were like, no, just play tennis. And I'm like, well, hold on a second. I'm like, you had to do something else when you were young. They're like, no, just play tennis. And it's kind of interesting. I started exploring this because every sport I say, hey, you got to do multiple sports when you're young. But then I started thinking about, okay, maybe tennis is different. And I started thinking about tennis, and I'm like, all right, let's see. You definitely throw the ball. When you serve, it's like overhead throwing. So you're throwing, striking. Let's see, you swing right hand, you do backhand, left hand. You sprint right and left. You sprint forward and backwards. You jump. And I'm like, it actually is kind of like multi-sport training. So unless your sport is like tennis, which I always say that's such a unique sport in that I feel like it develops all the athletic skills and the sport specific, there's very few sports like that. Very few sports that hit all the athletic components. So you gotta encourage your kids to do multiple sports, at least 3 or 4 sports when they're young, and keep that until they get through their growth spurt. After the growth spurt, like 14, then I think you can specialize. But by then, I think you should know whether which sports might be worthwhile specializing in. But just kind of interesting, the anecdote there, though. I think tennis has it right by default because the sport demands athletic skills.
No, I think you're right. And my early career, I was doing a lot more stuff in tennis than any other sport. I got access to the Williams sisters, Andy Roddick. They were great athletes that became tennis players, and that was evident to me. And the funny thing is, when I would hand them a jump rope, they knew what to do with it. When we'd ask them to do a push-up, they'd say how many. It was like they weren't insulated from what we would have used as athleticism in 1950, meaning if you can't jump rope, I'd like you to go through the journey to learn how to get that vertical crispness. If you can't push up, I'm not saying the push-up is going to make you great. It's going to be hard to express your full potential. So these simple things that most parents know, pull-ups, push-ups, climbing, bear crawling on a hill, jump rope, these are so much better than maybe booking a session on a high-speed treadmill at an incline with somebody with a clipboard. That's just so much better all the way around.
I'll say one more thing, and maybe we can end it on this, is that movement is developmental. So it's sequential, right? So you learn A, then B, then C. It's hard to skip. You skip some of these. If you skip movement patterns, you develop what are called proficiency barriers. Like, hey, if I can't skip, then it's hard for me to do hip to shoulder separation and things that'll prevent you from going farther. There was a doctor by the name of Dr. Vern Seefeld that kind of showed these proficiency barriers and where it would show up in sports. And one of these things that we found is you can develop these movement patterns any time in your life. It's just easier when you're a kid. But we'll take our tour players that, let's say a tour player comes in and says, hey, I just don't have the velocity that I'm looking for. And one of the first things we do is we're like, did you develop these athletic movements when you were a kid? And we actually go and we test our adults with some of these movements like skipping and hopping, jumping. And it's amazing on how many of them don't have the basic movement skills that any athlete would have. And we have to actually go back. And we have these, let's say like a mini tour player is trying to get to the next level, just doesn't have that next thing. And part of that thing is they don't have the athletic skills. We're having them like they're in elementary school. They're skipping and hopping and sliding, but those are the things that they need to do or else we can't advance them any further.
FMS One is designed for fitness, healthcare, and performance professionals who are looking to evaluate and understand how well their clients, patients, and athletes move. This is a highly interactive certification course that equips you with the tool industry leaders use to guide their programming decisions. During this course, you will learn how the 7 fundamental patterns of the movement screen relate to and affect many of our daily activities, and how mobility, motor control, and functional pattern concepts play a role in the screening process. You'll be able to identify correct screening techniques and common mistakes so your screen results are consistent and reliable. The FMS One learning environment consists of a movement lab, performing the screen with your peers, and engaging in screening demonstrations with your instructors. Are you ready to have a reliable tool that sets a movement baseline and provides a tight feedback loop to guide your programming decisions? Take a look at our upcoming courses and get started today.
Next up is our guest, Mike Perry. Mike works with kids in a range of ages, primarily through his gym, Skill of Strength. Mike discusses movement in kids from elementary to middle school and gives tips for setting up younger children for development and success.
So Mike, I know you do a lot of youth training, kids running around your gym. I've seen some of the stuff you post on Instagram. It really looks pretty cool. What do you do? What's kind of your secret, or what are your thoughts on training kids?
It's organized play. That's all it is. It's taking a lot of those things that we did as young kids and trying to replicate a lot of those movements and games inside the gym. Simply, specifically the elementary and middle school athletes, we just put them in an environment where they can play and they can run and they can figure it out on their own. I found that you're not gonna verbally coach, a 6th grader with a hip hinge, right? It's just not going to happen. They don't have the attention span. They need to move, they need to explore, and they just need to have fun with it. So what we try to do is we try to put them in an environment where we can start to gradually maybe focus on certain skill sets, but we always do it via games or via movement exploration. So we're never saying we're doing speed training, right? We're just going to say, hey, see that cone? All right, here's what I need you to do. You guys each have a tennis ball. You're going to sprint. First one puts the ball in the cone wins.
So is it always groups, or you don't do any? I mean, I'm assuming right now it's no one-on-one, but it's always group training.
Honestly, training like an elementary school or a middle school kid one-on-one 9 times out of 10 is a miserable experience, because again, the parents want that formal training, right? They want, he needs to do this, he needs to get faster, and it's like, no, he needs to be a kid. And I find that when you put kids in groups, they tend to, sometimes they get a little crazy, right? But they just feed off one another and they get to play. They get to have fun. And what I try to do is I always try to think of, okay, in the back of my head, what is my end goal down the road? What am I trying to develop? But how can I start that process via games, via movement exploration? And then I just go from there. And I'll bring my kids to the gym on the weekend and I'll just have them do stuff. And that's my research, right? I'll put out an obstacle course or I'll try to find different things for them to do. And I just put them in certain situations and let the environment and let the layout do the teaching, because that's going to be a much better teacher than I can ever do.
No, I like that, and it's very wise that you do that. Number one, having a few kids in the room gives you an example of everything you'd like to talk about, but at the point where you should be talking about it. So somebody's always going to do good or not good at something, and having the teaching moment is great. But when Danielle and I used to design the PE class, information, don't let it take over 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. Experience, that's about a 30-minute investment. Reflection, that's about a 5-minute thing. And if you know where you're going with today's lesson, whether it be to jump or to turn or to cut or whatever, then you shouldn't have more than 5 minutes of instruction. You should have 30 minutes of experience. And if the reflection is done well, you got about 5 minutes of that. But now they know what to work on or what to think about before their next opportunity. And so that's the way that I've always tried to do it. And I got a lot of ideas from the obstacle courses we created at FCS workshops and things like that, because it works pretty good for adults that are going for GPP too.
Well, Mike, do you need to screen kids? That's probably one of the most common questions we get when we teach and interact with professionals.
So I do believe at a certain point we need to start screening kids, and I think there's definitely a threshold, and it depends, because I believe some kids are ready. and some kids aren't. So, I kind of break it into two groups. We see this a lot in middle school, where you get that one middle school kid that is just, he's 2 to 3 years off of puberty, or they're just not there yet, and they can't even sit still, right? So there's no way you're gonna really get a screen on them. But then at the same time, when you have these young athletes that are early specializing, right? Their parents have decided at the age of 10 that they're going to sign their first pro contract, and because they're doing the same sport all year round, that's when I feel like the movement screen is a vital part of what they do, because again, they're going to have these overuse patterns, and they're going to be doing the same thing over and over again. And if we can just start to figure out what's going on early on, and then just, again, put them, still, they're young athletes, we're still going to put them in situations where they can have fun and play and explore, but we need to do something to offset of them playing soccer, ice hockey, or baseball 12 months out of the year.
No, I think it's also the only other time where I think you're probably wise to do a screen if you've got 10 kids coming in and one of them has actually had a lost time injury. They've been in a cast for a little while. They've had a surgery, something weird. That's probably good just to know, because many times that injury is not over. It's just hidden and it's avoided. And so the screen in that instance does help you reconcile if a past medical history is still current or somewhere in the past. So if you've got a kid that's already been injured in a big way, that's had some pros on that job, I'd go back and check on the screen that one too.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this to a lot of people, and they ask me about strength and conditioning for their kids. And these kids are coming in these days, and they've got kinesio tape all over them, and they've got knee straps, and they've got elbow straps, and they've got this gear bag of things that are going to potentially help them. I'm like, listen, I don't think your kid needs more kinesio tape, right? I don't think that's going to fix them. I think they maybe need to just not play soccer 11 months out of the year and do something completely different. You wouldn't believe, what one of my movement screens is for middle school athletes? Skipping. You can tell a lot. You can tell a lot about a young athlete by how they skip. I can't tell you how many times the right leg and the right arm goes up at the same time, and you're going, man, we're going to spend, like, skipping, like a fun, frolicky thing we did as a kid. Some of these kids cannot skip.
And what's your quickest solution? If you had to reset the skip, do you teach a kid how to skip, or do you give them something a little earlier in that development that resets that? What's your strategy there? I think that's a great observation, but what do you do about it? Because we've all seen it.
So I think one of the things that I do is I'll start by introducing skipping to see it as like a screen. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I won't teach skipping. I'll actually just say, guys, we're just going to run for a little bit. All right, we're just going to run for a little bit. And I just want you to run as fast as you can. And then they take off, and then their arms and their legs sync up. And I'm like, okay, you see what you just did? And then I'll make an example of not making an example of the kid, but I'll use that individual as a point so I can demonstrate to the other athletes. Hey, you see what they did? Like, you see when they were running and their arms were moving? That's really what we're trying to do. We're just trying to break it down a little bit. So guys, when you run, just think about using your arms a little bit more. And then once they get it and they experience it, then we can go back and kind of re-cue it and redial in some things. And then we start real slow. We start with marching. And then once we, get the marching down, then they'll march forward and they'll march sideways and they'll march backwards. And eventually we can get them into skipping. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the times, to get the outcome you're looking for, you can't just give them the same thing over and over again. You got to give them something completely different that they know that they can do. Every kid can run. And most kids can run using their arms, because it's already ingrained into their nervous system. But if you ask them to skip, then all of a sudden it's that weird looking thing. So a lot of the times we reteach the skip simply by just asking them to run and then having them feel it. And then we bring them back. And then once they understand it and they're aware of it, then that gives us time to teach. No,
I'm glad that you said that, because many people do evoke another movement pattern like skipping. They make it a test, but then if you practice the test, are you sure you really fixed the thing? And so running is naturally reciprocal, and actually you're slower without it. Crawling is too. So many times I've had adults that can't skip. We've had to go all the way back to crawling. But once again, you've got to go reciprocal, and then we bring it right back up into the thing. And so anybody can make up a test and then practice it. And I commend you for going outside the movement screen and looking for other quick little checks, but then not sitting there and coaching that thing up, letting it emerge naturally the way it's supposed to.
Yeah. I mean, it's and I learned the hard way because I was that guy that had, the mini band on the thumb and on the elbow and getting the 90-90 action. And all it did was confuse them and shoot mini bands around the damn room. Honestly, it was useless. And I learned the hard way because I'm like, I know how to teach people to skip. No, that's how you teach a high school athlete to skip. That's not how you teach a middle school athlete to skip or run. You have to let them go back to stuff they already know how to do and then translate it. Same thing with the bear crawls. We use bear crawls all the time. That's their upper body strength training. Throw a sandbag on their back or we use cornhole boards, the cornhole bags rather. Mm-hmm. It teaches them about posture, teaches them about upper body training and opposing limb reciprocation. Man, the bear crawl is an awesome exercise and people look at it as a conditioning tool. And yes, there is a conditioning component, but I look at it as hey man, we're going to check 3 boxes with one exercise and it's fun. Cool. That's going to work.
Yeah, it's like pretty much fixing your push-up, your upper body motor control, your lower body motor control at the same time. It just resyncs. And I do think that the movement screen has taught us if we don't go super corrective too quick and just go back in development to a thing you can do, that thing will actually set a better foundation sometime. You just need to rehearse it.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't overcoach kids. Everybody tries to do this, chest up, and it's just like, no, you're just. I did a video of my son. He's like, he might have been 3 at the time, and I was like, hey, I'm going to coach my son on the push-up, and he's doing push-ups. And again, he's a little kid. He's just having fun, and people probably looked at that and like, that's a stupid looking push-up, and I'm like, no, chest up, brace your abs, like tuck your tail, like tilt your pelvis, and I'm like, guys, this is what overcoaching looks like. Like you look like a complete idiot when you're giving a 4-year-old cues on the push-up. You're just wasting time. You're not gonna. They don't get it. So I think the biggest issue people have with training young athletes is they try to overcoach them. They try to let the verbal part of coaching be more dominant than the experience of what's going on.
Well, I think what you said earlier, right when we started, was put them in the environment where they can respond to that environment. You just create the environment to get out of it what you want, and then they'll just figure it out.
Exactly. And I do that almost all the time now. I'm thinking to myself, like, what do these kids need? A lot of these I work with a lot of soccer players. A lot of these young soccer players can't throw and catch. They cannot throw and catch. I mean, it's one of the most ridiculous things that they do. And their hand-eye coordination isn't great because they do everything with their feet, right? They can do 9 step-overs with a soccer ball, and it looks great, but they can't literally catch a tennis ball. So like the other day, I'm having them, and I'm going, how can I work on something split stance, and how can I work on hand-eye coordination? I get them in half kneeling. I have them throw a tennis ball in the air. They clap 3 times. They have to stand up, and they have to catch the tennis ball. There's their half kneeling position. There's their hand-eye coordination. There's that ability to start to slowly own that split stance pattern of strength training. That's all. Same thing with tall kneeling. You put them in tall kneeling. Cool. Throw it in the air. They can decide what foot's going to swing out front to get them to half kneel, to get them to standing. So again, I'm looking at patterns in which we use, but I'm creating games which are going to reinforce those patterns, which are going to give me the outcome that I'm looking for.
And that's cool because now you're also giving them a task that requires motor planning. And we always motor plan around our problems, not through them. So if we motor plan that, you're going to see that hiccup real quick, and just working through that almost fixes itself. And I commend you because when a lot of people started taking some movement screening tactics to the kids, I literally think that they were doing too much corrective and not enough play, and the play will correct itself because, these fundamental movement patterns, let's be honest, they're subconscious. So with a person who can really squat doesn't think about it anymore, but they can get low anytime they have to. And that's where the difference in a skill like throwing a ball or kicking a ball or throwing a punch or something like that is completely different than squat, lunge, push, pull, plank. These are things that should spontaneously occur subconsciously. Coaching them consciously doesn't make a lot of sense.
I always talk to my, when I'm working with my other coaches, I say, sneak the patterns into the game.
Love it. Love it.
Super simple. Whatever you're trying to get out of it, sneak it in. Find a game in which they do it and create a game. Just create a fun game. So just whatever you're trying to do. And again, as a movement guy, I'm always thinking, bilateral stance, split stance, opposing limb stuff. And at a higher level, that's important. But again, if we just sneak the movement into the game, they will develop it. And that's the easiest way to get kids moving better and having just an overall greater movement map.
So when it comes to this kids program and training youth athletes, we've really gotten into some of the programming of it and how to develop a program, but how do you kind of even set it up before that? How do you distinguish like the age groups that are going to work together, maybe what equipment you need for the age groups, and then how that's really designed in that way? Because I think sometimes when people think about developing a kids program, they're like, well, I can't put a 6-year-old with a 14-year-old. And so how do you come up with that type of design?
So we have elementary school age, in which that is very much the playground obstacle course type scenario. And again, we don't coach. The only thing we tell them to do is, stop picking your nose and stop hitting the kid next to you. Like that's pretty much our coaching with those athletes. And then once we get into middle school, we start to sneak a little bit more of the patterns into their programming. And then we have to almost profile kids at a certain point when they're ready to learn how to actually squat, deadlift, or lunge. And that's when we just sit down, say to the parents, hey, we've noticed that Billy is just, he's in this group and he's doing really well. And we feel that he's probably going to be held back by spending all of his time here. Not that he can't use those skills and those movements, but he's probably ready to start learning how to, deadlift and squat and actually do some formal strength training. So that's at that age, that's that middle school age where we have to make that decision. And we can tell pretty quickly whether or not they're ready for a formal strength training program. And that's when we just say, hey, you're ready for the next thing. And that's when we have a sit down with the parents and we just educate their parents. Hey, based off of our expertise and what we see, this is what your son or daughter is ready for. And I actually think that the parents really appreciate that, because we're not all about just selling memberships and trying to get people through the door. We're about doing the right thing. And a lot of the times the right thing may not bring as much money in as at first, and financially is not always the best thing, but down the road, it always comes back. And like, we've got a middle school program that we've got like almost 50 kids in, and we have to actually keep on adding groups. And it's simply because we are creating environments for these kids where they're having a blast and they're learning, and their parents are thrilled. And because of schools right now, because of COVID, it's just crazy. They're shutting things down and they're limiting recess, and they stand in boxes and wave to their buddy, and it's like, this is freaking ridiculous, man. They need to move. And I feel like we're actually taking the place of a lot of the physical education stuff that should be happening, but due to regulations and everything else, it's a little crazy. So I think that's one of the reasons why our youth programs have done so well.
In middle school, I think introducing them to a little bit of resistance training beyond body weight makes a lot of sense. The problem is, I do think it's a slippery slope, because if you get them on 2 or 3 fundamental lifts and let their own hormone cocktail, which is coming right around the corner, let them have that fingertips to toes, full body stress. Whether you teach a deadlift or maybe you're working with an athlete that has to be just body weight plus a little bit more of a get up. If you've got just a few fundamental lifts, that's really all you need, because really when you think about it, you're not developing a muscle group. You're creating a overall metabolic and mechanical stress. And those hormones will be used in a very good way to come back stronger every time. So I do think that adding resistance is good. But then I think where the slippery slope is we feel we're responsible for addressing every muscle group on the anterior, posterior chain, and it's not like that at all. A few good deadlifts and some jump rope will be all the stress somebody needs coming from a body weight, getting a plyo and a fingertips to toes stress.
Yeah, I mean, parents always come in and little Billy needs this, and it's like, he needs to get stronger, he needs to get faster. Listen, once these kids hit puberty, they're going to get stronger, they're going to get faster, right? I mean, that's just simply how it is. So, I mean, that's the things that people don't really understand. It's like, it's going to come. Don't worry. Like, you can't force this. Let them develop, and each kid develops at a very, very different rate. And, your kids, trust me, I see it in my own boys now. I got a 5 and a 9-year-old. My 9-year-old, he eats like a freaking adult. I mean, and he is just, I'm like constantly feeding him, and he's exercising, and it's like, eventually he's gonna grow up and he's gonna get bigger, stronger, faster. It's just development. It's really just let them grow up. Things are gonna happen. Stop saying that your 10-year-old needs a speed and agility coach. He does not need a freaking speed and agility coach. He just needs to have fun. Those things will happen.
Yeah, keep it between the lines. Don't get extreme.
Exactly.
Well, Mike, thank you for joining us again today. Where can our audience kind of find you? Are you on social media or anything?
Yeah, so our gym, Skill of Strength, you can find on Facebook and Instagram, and my personal account, Coach Mike Perry on Instagram. You can check that out, and I'm always putting videos out, whether it's kids, kettlebells, movement-based stuff. So come say hello.
Great. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We close with guest Eric DeGotti. Eric has spent years developing youth athletes and training high-profile clients. He joins the show today to discuss how our culture has helped create one-sport athletes and focuses his discussion on coaching high school youth.
So, Eric, there's a lot of discussion now, especially with a lot of what we've talked about is, kids or youth are not getting the right type of training and physical education. So I know you train some kids, some youth. Give us your kind of rundown on how you approach that.
First, we got to define what a kid is. As I joke,
Very true.
Every year I get older, everybody's a kid. So there's a big difference between that adolescent, middle school, 6th through 8th grade versus high school, and what they have to encounter. In terms of, are they doing their sport to get in shape, or they need to now get in shape to do their sport? And now they're going to get thrown in high school into a weight room, which may or may not help the issue and may compound that. And then also talking about where they're at in terms of being a multi-sport athlete versus now this over-specialization of things. All those things are factors to consider when you're talking about with the youth athlete.
Well, if you separate those two athletes, put them in buckets for us, we've got youth that I think it's obvious they're not a superstar at anything. They just need some general physical preparedness. And then there are people who are playing 3 seasons of the same sport. And those are two completely different things. So give us GPP first and then take us into that specialization.
Yeah, and unfortunately, what we've done is we've taken that performance pyramid and flipped it upside down, right? Everybody starts with the skill and then just hopes all the rest will flush out, but it doesn't. And you have kids who are throwing weighted balls but can't touch their toes. And so that's where the disconnect is there, in kind of pumping the brakes and saying, we need to check a few boxes first before I can tell you whether that is a good activity or not. Is this a great drill or not? To the skill coach or to the athlete who's looking to go into practice and what do I do to get better? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to be able to be able to move and just cover some basic things, touch your toes, be able to rotate, lunge, decelerate, those sorts of things. And then once we can do that, then it's a matter of, is this a horsepower issue, right? You have the most pretty swing in the world, but you can't hit it past the infield. Well, now we need to actually develop some fitness in you. And then on top of that the skill becomes the easy part. If I give any coach a good athlete, they'll figure out how to make him a good baseball player, basketball player, fill in the blank.
Yeah, and in my opinion, I'm not sure as much as all of us would probably agree. Specialization's not not what should happen for kids, for younger kids. They shouldn't be playing. They shouldn't be a pitcher at age 9, right? They should be playing and doing other things. But I think that ship has sailed. I think that mentality, as much as we can debate it on this podcast or whatever, I definitely think parents have it in their heads that my kid's a baseball player, he's going to be a baseball player year round. And now us as professionals just have to deal with that. And we have to train around that. Would you agree with that?
100%. And a lot of that isn't so much the parents making that decision for them as it is the culture making
the
that
environment,
decision,
right? Exactly,
making that decision for them. Well, if you don't play on our fall team, you're not going to make the spring team, and if I don't make the spring team, I might not make the high school team, and I could set my kid back, and never play high school if I don't commit at 9 years old to the fall team, and so that pressure puts them in this rabbit hole that they just can't get out of.
The idea of the culture, accelerating that. That idea that you have to participate in everything. Do you think that's a financial gain of these preparedness, these companies that consistently training year round, constantly in season, or do you think it's the culture of the sport itself, like you have to get better by doing this?
I think there's absolutely a financial motivation behind it, with all the move away from school programs into clubs and that sort of thing. But there is an element of the more skilled that sport is, the more time investment you need. And one of the worlds that I work a lot in is baseball. It's very hard for an athlete to show up freshman year and say, hey, I think I'm going to try baseball. It's just, there's too many at-bats. There's too many opportunities to learn that skill that you've missed on, and to catch up, it's going to be a little bit too hard because of the nature of the intensive of the skill. Whereas you can get a really good athlete show up as junior year of high school and jump on the lacrosse team and figure it out a little bit easier because there's less of those fine motor skills and specific skill specific type of things.
What I hear you saying is you got to navigate the culture of the sport. And the one thing I commend you in both golf and baseball is you know the sport. And I honestly think that gives you a competitive advantage when talking to parents and skill coaches as to exactly what you do need to work with and what you're going to stay away from. And I think that's, knowing the sport and the fact that there is a culture attached to it. There are just some things you're not going to be able to say or do. And then there's a lot you can once you realize it.
Yeah, one of the cool experiences, I actually just had this. I have a new baseball school I started doing programs with the other night. And I had I said, let's have some fun with this. I got all the skill coaches were there watching. And I said, wait until I'm done. And then I'm going to sit you down with the kids that I just screened. Then I'm going to predict exactly what this kid is on the field. All right, this kid's a pitcher who's super whippy and fast, but doesn't have a lot of control. Bingo. This kid is a catcher, and he's long, and he's got this big loopy swing, and if he connects, it's gone. But he just can't control it all. And just kind of going through this laundry list by just going through a movement evaluation and an athletic evaluation to say, I can pretty much tell what you are as a player without ever seeing you pick up a bat or a glove or a ball, and it freaks out the coaches. And it's a cool experience to say, like, there's more to this than taking 1,000 swings a day, than taking 100 ground balls a day, because that's what I grew up in. That culture is more is better. And I just got really good at a bad swing, right?
Yeah, Lee and I have experienced the same thing. We've worked with a lot of PGA and LPGA professionals. And the funny thing is, we get 40 minutes into our day doing our thing, measuring and treating and then retesting and stuff like that. Like, don't you want to see me swing? And like, well, if you really want us to watch you swing, that's fine, but I got all I need. And I've seen Greg Rose do that in golf. And so what you're actually looking at is I can still see some things on the field that I can't see from here. But everything you can't do here is not even at your disposal on the field, and that's where you met him. And I think it's almost like you're looking in a crystal ball to them, but it's like it's the lost art of movement without going specialization. If your ankles don't bend, you're going to have to do this thing a whole nother way, and there's no way you can compete.
Well, I think you said it. You said it to start, and I think it's been the theme with some of the other guys we've had on talking about youth training is, taking this idea of this pyramid where you got to have movement at the bottom, then you got to be strong to make sure you can handle the movement, and then ultimately skill, and inverted it. And I think that's the common thought process for parents, for coaches, coaches that we really, talking about parents and their kids, but coaches think that you've got to go out and just swing and swing and swing. And that's part of it, but you've got to have the foundation to do that. You've got to have the fundamentals of movement, of strength, stability, mobility, flexibility, all those things in order to go practice at a higher level.
That's just learning basic motor learning. And I always say that whether you're a ballroom dance instructor, whether you're a baseball coach, or whether a strength coach, we're all just teaching movement. We're just teaching it at different levels and different amplitudes, and learning how to break down and chunk out how we're going to achieve these skills is the art of really teaching and coaching, and saying you don't get to do C until you've showed me that you can do A first, and then we'll go to B. And then if you get to C, great. But everybody's trying to post on Instagram the cool drills for C, and then everybody wants to replicate that, right? Whereas if I can get you better by just doing A and B really, really well, and then get you to C.
It's funny. I got an opportunity to do some strength conditioning advising with a local college baseball team. I said, let's do a movement screen. I want to see a 30-second jump rope test. And I want to see who can do 5 pull-ups. And the movement screens are horrible. And the only thing people did worse than jump rope was the pull-ups. We had like 5 kids on the team that could cover 5 pull-ups. Now, if I take you back in time, both my grandfathers were in World War II. 5 pull-ups was a minimum to serve. That means 5 pull-ups wasn't a big issue for most young men in the pre-World War II era. Right now, I got a guy saying, give me a competitive advantage with my baseball team. By the way, most of them can't do 5 pull-ups. And I'm not talking about it from a strength. The integrity of your grip, shoulder, and upper carriage that can't handle 5 pull-ups tells me that you got to a level of baseball nobody's ever gotten to before, because pull-ups just used to be a given. I don't think my grandfathers were training pull-ups. they could just do 5. And it was just part of being a young man at the time. And so I was blown away that I had to explain how pull-ups and jump rope can both be bottlenecks with upper body strength, range of motion, and plyometrics. And I was just like blown away that we got to have this conversation, but we had to have that conversation.
But Eric, speak to that, because I think that's an important point, is convincing parents and coaches and kids, and forget even that group, almost anybody now that's practicing or training for a sport. And Gray's story about the baseball team, those baseball players and that coach were so disconnected that they just think they need to be in the cage or on the mound or on the field. How do you convince them that they need to be getting, in Gray's scenario, 5 pull-ups? What's that conversation like for you?
Sometimes it's just as simple as doing some basic testing. I had a high school baseball team, and we did screenings. Probably it was January, right? Mm-hmm. And I think 30% of the team had pain on at least one screen. And I explained to them, like, nothing with a 2x6 and a dowel rod should hurt. And if it hurts now in January, it's not going to get any better when you start whipping a ball around in March, right? So that's the first problem we have. So you already have ticking time bombs that are half lit. The second thing is when he watched the overhead squat, and I had not one kid on the entire roster get higher than a 1. And he said, well, now it makes sense why nobody could squat last year. Like, we tried to do squats in the weight room last year, and everybody complained how it hurt, and it was such a pain in the neck to coach it, and we tried it with boxes, we tried every imaginable machination of a squat, and the kids couldn't squat. I said, yeah, they can't even do the movement, let alone load it. So there was the shining example of, well, maybe just don't squat until they can. And even if they can't ever put a bar on their back, it's okay. They'll still have the ability to become pretty good baseball players. And that was kind of the eye-opening thing, to say, wow, just watch them move a little bit and see, and even seeing the differences between certain kids, to see if we're looking at, going back to the pull-up example, is I'm always peeling back that onion and say, all right, well, before you even look at your pull-up, can you even hang from a bar? Right? Look at one of our auxiliary tests in the FCS and say, can you even hang from a bar for 60 seconds? And when the team and the coach says, all right, well, I got one kid hanging for 1:20 and I got another kid hanging for about 18 seconds, well, you might not want to get them all in the same program. Right.
It's almost like introducing carries before you teach somebody to deadlift, doing a hang before you get somebody doing a pull-up. But what a lot of people don't understand is, if they can't squat, how are we going to get some weight on these kids? And I'm like, the deadlift is right there. But if you can't do 5 pull-ups, you don't get to deadlift, because it's the same engine, just needs to run a little bit slower. So pull-ups give me access to that body tension. The deadlift takes me away from those stiff knees, weak ankles, tight hips, and still allows you to sort of get some core strength. And we can explore your squat while we're doing your deadlift and after we fixed your pull-ups. And a lot of people don't have time for that. They just need to load that back squat and pretend like they're doing something. So
your only tool is a hammer. Everything looks like a nail.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Eric, for being here today. We really appreciate you coming in studio and visiting us in Chatham again.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks.
That'll do it for this episode of the Movement Podcast. Thanks for listening. And if you liked what you heard, please take a minute to subscribe and review. If you want to learn more about our system and take the next step in your movement journey, visit us at movementpod.com. Until next time, be sure to first move well, then move often.